iliums. We're going to talk simple listings. First of all, PI, AS, EXIN. And then I'll talk about the combination of those two. That's what we'll finish setting up on the rest of the day. With the ilium adjustments, as we're dealing with the pelvis, as Mark has already addressed, when we put our posture of our stabilization, we're going to focus on balancing ourselves and our weight distribution on the distal half of the patient's thigh so we don't lock the pelvis up. And so we can still make contact, but you saw he slid his hand in between his thigh and the patient's thigh because he wasn't holding pressure on that proximal portion. That's simply for the pragmatic solution of letting the pelvis move a little bit when we make the thrust. Now, as all general rules are, there's always a little exception. The only exception to that would be if someone's a very, very flexible individual and you've planted your weight on the distal half and you push and that pelvis just moves at 4 or 5 inches. Then you have to put a little bit more pressure on the proximal half on that case only. Otherwise, it's the same as what Mark showed you for the sacrum. We're dealing with the iliums. In simple listings, PI or AS, we can push the PI, we can push the AS. You can pull a PI somewhat. There's not a lot of leverage to do that, but you could. There's no real pull move for the AS. You would see perhaps a combination of a push contact on the AS region and then a kick stabilization to accomplish that AS or an ASIN combination. When we're dealing with the push moves for the pelvis, it's always going to be a padded pisiform as our contact hand, on our contact end. The articulation for a PI is at the inferior portion of the PSS. That's your signal contact point for a PI. So padded pisiform, inferior border of the PSS. If we have a combination with a PIEX or IN, all we do is go either a little medial if it's IN, or a little lateral to that if it's EX. It's that simple. The patient's ilium is going to be on the upside. I'm going to bring them over and make our contact just like this. On the inferior border of the PSS, fingers are pointing down towards the table. For the PI, I need to swing this elbow up in this position and not way down here. Even though it's posterior inferior, once we contact the inferior portion of the PSS, in our mind, we're thinking about thrusting directly into the articulation, P to A. I already have the I to S, elbow to wrist line, just like that. So the thrust is P to A. If you're having trouble with your PIs or PIEXs, it's because your elbow's down here and you're thrusting into the lumbar spine. So get this elbow out here like this and push straight into the articulation. Alrighty? That's your PI. If we add the EX component with that, I just go lateral, little tissue go lateral to medial, and slightly torque that tissue. So I end up with my fingers pointing down towards the table, just like this. I get my arm up into position. The wrist line slightly I to S, elbow to wrist, slightly lateral to medial for the EX. I thrust straight into the articulation, and I torque. Remember the distal portion of my wrist, meaning my pisiform with the tip of the screwdriver, so I'm turning to reduce that EX component. So the lateral to medial plus the torque addresses the EX here. The P to A and the elbow to wrist addresses the PI component. We thrust in and torque at the same time. It doesn't mean we torque our elbow this way, it means we drive and turn in our wrist just like that. Right. If it's a PIIN, we're just going to go medial to that inferior border of the PSS. Here's pisiform again. I'm going to swing my arm around and contact like this, pointing the fingers back to the doc's abdomen. A little I to S, elbow to wrist for the PI, medial to lateral for the IN. And I thrust again directly into the articulation as we do that. P to A, and then because we're medial to lateral, it opens it up. And because the torque now goes down toward the patient's feet, how that, as we say, the tail, as we drive that, it's not swinging the elbow down, it's driving and turning at the wrist. That also takes the upright of the IN and reduces it. With that ilium listing of a PI, EX, it has a downright. So that's a nice marriage. PI and then EX out and then down a little bit more. The PI, IN rides up slightly in that articulation. So as we thrust, we reduce the PI, P to A, we open it up, medial to lateral, and then that downright is turned with the torque like that. If you're having trouble visualizing that, get the chapters out and see how those spots occur in the quadrant where we make the SI center point the center of the quadrant. You see how those can occur like that. So that's a simple PI, that's your PIIN. and PIEX, pushes. Questions about that? You visualizing that okay? We're going to cover a lot of stuff here, but we'll set up on these for the next hour and a half. We can also pull those two situations. If I have a PIIN, and when would I choose to do that? Probably if there's an IN as the major component. Because it's harder to get a PI, P-to-A thrust here with a pull setup, fingertip push. It's pretty easy to hook inside that PSS and pull this thing open. Plus we have the kick of the leg opens that ilium up and gives us a tremendous amount of leverage. We can pull the EX component, if that's the major factor, PI2EX7. That's what I mean by the major component. And if we pull the EX factor, that's going to have the ilium on the downside. Let's talk about a straight EX first as a pull. The ilium is on the downside, contact to the lateral aspect of the PSIS, pisiform. We're going to reach the tissue, pull it across, so we end up with our pisiform right on that segmental contact point, the lateral aspect of the PSS. Just like that. I'm going to turn my antecubital fossa like this, so I have my forearm going straight across the pelvis. And so when I make this correction, I'm coming across by going into flexion with my arm, using the biceps. I'm also extending my wrist at the same time, and because the EX, as it goes external, has a little downright, I'm also going to use some ulnar deviation as I do that. Ready? And the goal is not to pick them off the table like that, it's to bring it straight across like that. So it's a combination of wrist extension, ulnar deviation, and pull with the arm as we do that.
Can you tell those of us that are a little bit slow what the antecubital fossa is?
Antecubital fossa is right here. Isn't that correct? Who's the latest guys in anatomy? See, I remember a little bit of that. And I'm making a point of that rather than having it here, because if you leave it out here, you'll probably end up pulling them up off the table. If you turn it in like that, it comes across this way. A little more leverage for you. Plus, you're using your biceps as you do it, and extension with the wrist, and ulnar deviation like that. A lot of leverage to make that correction. That's your EX pull. A PI EX pull, we're going to go on the inferior lateral border of that PSS, and slide the tissue across and up a little bit. Here I need to angle my forearm, expose that antecubital fossa. On this one, we are leaning more towards the patient's head. So this is a little bit of a difference in what we talked about. Our pulls, we were straight over the segment. Here we need to lean a bit. So as we come across, we can pull upwards also. So it's the same action, across for the EX and then up for the PI. So you can see a little more difficult to reduce PI with the pull than it would be the EX. A little more leverage to get the PI reduced with the push than it is with the pull. So that's a good way as a decision maker. Well, Bill, what if it's like PI5 and EX5? Figure it out, okay? You can do either a push or a pull on that, and one might work better than the other. Bill, can I push the PI and then pull the EX? Yeah, you probably could, but if you got a decent set with the push, I wait and see what happens. Come in the next time, see what you gain in the articulation, see what the response is with the patient, see what the edema feels like in the tenderness, etc. You might get the action that you need just with the push. Is it possible that you do the push and you get some correction, but now it stops responding and you need to flip them over and do the pull because you've reduced the PI and now you've got to catch up with the EX? Yes. And vice versa. We'll just have to see how the case plays out. All right, that's a PI-EX pull. EX pull. The IN pull, the involved ilium is going to be on the upside. It's easy to remember that. If I had the IN down and tried to pull that, I'd make it worse, wouldn't I? So it's on the upside. And here, I can hook right inside that PSS, 2 or 3 fingers, just like Mark showed you with the rotated sacrum. Get my leg up into position. As I do this, downward pressure, the ilium opens up, and I thrust medial to lateral, just like that. That's the IN, and torque my fingers for the upright of that IN. That's your IN pull. PI-IN pull, I would be on the inferior medial portion of the PSS. Don't worry about memorizing this, just think of what the segment has done, and then you know where you have to put your fingers to make the correction. Inferior medial border of the PSS. Fingers will stand up here. We kick down into the table, we pull open, and then thrust P away through our fingertips for the PI component. So again, a little more difficult to get the PI reduced here than it is the IN. So if I had like a PI2 IN7, I'd do the pull. If I had the PI7 IN2, I'd probably do the push. on the push. Fingers came right back to me like this. We thrust pede away and medial to lateral. Remember that torque downward with our bicycle. All right. Any questions about those so far? Are you staying with me? That's right. Now we get into the AS listings. For the AS listings, we have the AS contact region that can be found by going to PSS over 2 inches and down about 3. That gets us over this ischial spine region. And depending on the size of the patient, there may be a little or a lot of distance from the surface to that segmental contact area. Now back in '77, I asked Gunstead, since it's AS, why don't we go down on the ischium? When we have more leverage way down here? And he said, I tried that years ago, and he said, I found that it would bind up the articulation and it was harder to get it to move. He said, I found it worked better if I was at the lower end of the SI joint, which is right in here, to make those AS corrections. In case you're wondering minds wanted to know that, inquiring minds. That's why we're up in this region. All right? So PSS over 2 down 3, as I believe what the chapter says. Now straight AS, you're going to be right there. If it's ASEX, I've got to go lateral to medial, bring the tissue in and end up just lateral to that spot. If it's an ASIN, I've got to go medial to lateral and bring the tissue over and end up just medial to that spot. The tissue does all the help for us on these ASs when it comes to the IN and EX component. And we don't really have a pull, as I said, for the ASIN, other than I'll show you when we get a body up here, pisiform contact with a kick stabilization. We have a pull for the ASCX and a push for the ASCX. A push for the ASIN and a modified push, kick stabilization, pull, kick stabilization for the ASIN on the outside. So here we are, ASIN, PSS over 2 down 3. Now my wrist won't straighten up or won't extend very well, so when I do my ASs or ASINs, I have to turn it way around like that. On the ASIN, you will turn your hand down so you're facing right down to the patient's thigh like this. You get your elbow down in position so you get a medial to lateral component. You can roll them over quite a ways to do this. So I want to end up with my elbow to wrist pointing right down the shaft of the femur. And if it was a straight AS, if I thrust pede away, I'm at the lower end of that articulation, that will rock it right back down into position. If I have an ASIN, I'm going to go medial to lateral, take the tissue medial to lateral, just like that. Point my elbow to wrist down the shaft of the femur. And as I thrust, I'm already coming medial to lateral, elbow to wrist line. I'm pushing pede away for the AS component, medial to lateral for the IN component, and I'm going to torque my pisiform, again, as I drive that arm, cowdad, that's down towards the patient's feet, to help the upright of the IN component, just like that. I don't swing my elbow down as I do that. I'm just driving the entire time like this as I turn my wrist. Okay? The ASEX, I can push or pull that. I'll go to the lateral aspect of that AS contact area, which is, again, PSS over 2 down 3. Here I'm going to take my tissue pool lateral to medial and torque my hand just a little bit in preparation for the actual torque where the tissue is going to help me make that EX reduction. Get my arm in position. I have a little lateral to medial component of the elbow to wrist because of the EX. I have pede away down the shaft of the femur because of the AS. I'm going to thrust pede away down the shaft of the femur for the AS. I'm lateral to medial with the elbow to wrist, plus I'm going to drive and torque for the EX, just like this. That produces the EX component. So again, you can see if there's a lot of AS, this is a pretty good way to do an ASCX. If there's more EX, you're probably better off to try to pull that across rather than torque it all upwards and inwards and with the lateral to medial elbow to wrist. With the EX, correction, the ASEX, the involved pelvic listing is down. Here I need to take the tissue and traction it downward for the AS and across for the EX. So my forearm actually needs to be cradling the buttocks, sir. Just like this. And so when I make the correction, I'm cradling the pelvis like this. And as I make the correction, I thrust it's downward and then across simultaneously. So it's almost an arc type thrust, a J-shape type thrust, whatever you want to call it, C-shape. I don't care what you call it. But we're tractioning down for the AS and then across for the EX. And then once we get all that snugged up, which I'll show you on the patient, we make the thrust. Now, in the chapters, with the EX pulls, whether it's PIEX, EX pull, or ASEX pull, it says there's no kick. Our leg does get into position when we do that. The leg is a guide to coordinate the movement of these components of the pelvis, the leg drift, and the shoulder and the body as a unit here. So can you do it with just the pull of the arm? Yes, you can. Will you always be able to do it on every patient? Probably not. And so there are times when, as we get everything, slack is out, and we go to set it, and we get no place, we have to use a little bit of a kick to move that pelvis as we pull with the arm. But I want you to focus on the pull with the arm as the major component and the kick to be the minor component. And if possible, let that just be the guiding component and a balance aid for you as you're standing in that awkward position. Right? That's going to be the best way to do it, because when we're holding this pelvis, we've got it all torqued up here like that. We have to be really clean as we make this thrust. And the more we engage the leg and kick, the more we have a chance of torquing in the lumbar and the thoracic, so it gets us in trouble with these. So, all right, now, our lovely assistant, Dana White.